Hey everyone. This time we read Imagine That by Ed Smith and Benj Edwards. So the book follows the life of Ed Smith, and it's a really remarkable story. I just enjoyed probably 99% of this book. There's only one part that I didn't like, and I'll get into that at the end. So the book follows the life of Ed Smith as he was growing up in Brooklyn, and he's had a really remarkable life. He was one of the first African American engineers in the computer industry, and he contributed a lot to modern computers. So the first part of the book really kind of covers Benj Edwards and him sort of discovering Ed Smith and rediscovering the Imagination Machine. And we get a few sort of like testimonials of people that use the Imagination Machine. I didn't really like this part in the book because I didn't know what the Imagination Machine was at first. It's a computer and it's also a video game console. And not really knowing that right away was kind of like, okay, great, you guys had fun with it. Could somebody tell me what it is? After that, we get Ed's story, and it's kind of told a little bit out of order at first, and there's a pretty good reason for that. He kind of wants to go over a bunch of the people that he grew up with and sort of how they affected his life, both positively and negatively. He doesn't seem to have any animosity for those people. There is some humor in there when he's talking about certain people that he grew up with. So the bulk of the book, and probably my favorite part of the entire thing, I know that sounds a little weird, but it really, I loved most of this book, so it really was great hearing this. And it's Ed's story about how he became an engineer. It's really a great story about how, you just never give up. If you set a goal for yourself, do whatever you can to achieve it. Always have a backup plan, and always just keep looking to the future. Don't really kind of stay stagnant or anything like that. Ed had a lot of mentors growing up, especially ones that sort of saw his talent for engineering. He said like he would start learning things about electricity and kind of go out of his way to like tinker around with stuff, and he always got called to like go repair something if something needed to be repaired in his neighborhood. Some of the kids will bully him and everything, and this is where one of the jokes comes in. He's like, yeah, they bullied me, but as soon as like their radio or something didn't work, they weren't bullying me then. So eventually Ed's path takes him to APF, which did Palm consoles at first, and then moved on to get their own dedicated video game console. And that was the console that Ed actually designed and helped to put together. It's really remarkable that he was able to do this. It just, coming from somebody that doesn't know anything about electronics really, I think it's amazing that he did this and just put this console together and was able to, help out this company and get it sold and everything like that. Ed talks a little bit about African Americans in the video game industry, and this comes up repeatedly throughout the book when he starts going to conventions and he notices, I'm the only African American here. Or as he puts it, there's not a lot of pepper in this salt, saying, most of these people are just a bunch of white guys walking around. There are a few, people from Japan there, but for the most part, Ed's kind of by himself. He does talk a little bit about Jerry Lawson and the Fairchild Channel F, and I just want to go into a little bit of that here, because Ed goes into it in the book, and I want to kind of talk about that here. So throughout the book, Ed talks a little bit about this man, who is Jerry Lawson. He worked at a company called Fairchild and was one of the engineers behind the Fairchild Channel F. Even though it's not that well known today, or at least better known now with most video game historians, the Fairchild actually was the first video game console to have cartridges. It beat the Atari 2600 to the market, but it just didn't have the same staying power. They didn't have the same games that Atari had, and it just didn't last that long. He has a lot of stories about making the MP1000, and those are pretty cool, especially when it gets into some of the more nitty-gritty stuff about how he's trying to push for features, and also how he's kind of getting ignored a little bit when they go on to the Imagination Machine. So to go back to some of the conventions, when Ed's going to these, he's always bringing up talking to different people and kind of like picking their brain a little bit and learning things from them. And that's something that you see really throughout the book, is Ed is always trying to learn something new from all the different people he's meeting with. And that's kind of a really good lesson for people to take. You should always try to learn something from your job that you're working at. And even when you're not really working at the job, but you're doing something sort of related to it, you can always just try to pick people's brains, and maybe they come away with like a different perspective than you, or they maybe have something that you don't really have and you can kind of learn from them. Before the Imagination Machine, Ed worked on this console. It was the MP1000. Now, this had a lot to do with being an Atari clone, but it was a very good one. They'd also mention in the book about a programmer named Laura, which I would really like to know more about, because she programmed a bunch of the games for the MP1000. But we'll save that for another time, because this is Ed's story. I just want to say one thing about the console. No offense to Ed, but I really hate that controller. I just don't understand why you have so many buttons on it. That's just me. These games are fairly simple. You probably didn't need that many buttons on the thing. So after the MP1000, Ed and also APF start talking about going into the computer industry. And this is kind of where APF falls apart, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But let's kind of check out some pictures of the Imagination Machine, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So this was the first iteration of the Imagination Machine. You can see it's got the MP1000 on top of it, and then it's got a keyboard and a built-in cassette tape deck. So you can see the tape deck that's built in on the side there. That was meant for cassette tapes, which even at the time was kind of an outdated format, or at least was going away in favor of, like the actual discs, like the floppy disks and everything like that. Ed pushed to have a floppy disk drive added onto it, and I think that might have helped the system out a little bit. I still can't really get over the fact that this kind of feels a bit like a Sega CD. The reason I say that is I got the impression from reading it that the first version of the Imagination Machine needed the MP1000 in order to really work. And that just kind of kills the thing for me, because when you need a console to make the computer work, it sort of defeats the purpose. That would get rectified in the second version of the Imagination Machine, but they kept the cassette tape on that version as well. And as Ed was explaining, that just really killed the momentum that they had with it. As Ed explains, that kind of came a little bit too late, though, because APF was just sort of running out of money at that point. They made a lot of bad decisions, to be perfectly honest, and they really didn't listen to their engineers. If they had listened to Ed and they had listened to a few of the other engineers, they might have lasted longer. I don't know if they would have lasted through the video game crash, but they might have lasted a little bit longer than they did. And from APF really falling apart, this is where Ed's backup plans kind of come in. He had also studied marketing at the time, so all the while he's going to these different jobs, he's continuing to learn and continuing to go to school. It doesn't necessarily say that he graduated, but I'm assuming that he did graduate from the different colleges he went to. So he has a background in sales, and he's also built a lot of his, marketing stuff and a lot of his sales contacts from going around with the Imagination Machine. So as he's always talking to people, he's always learning and he's remembering people, and he's building relationships kind of across, not just the computer industry, but also the retail industry. So the last part of it, he's basically selling technology, and he's always learning new things about technology so that he can become a better salesman. And it all ends up with, Ed giving back to the community and continuing to honestly just be a really great guy and a really just impressive person overall. So we get to the only part that I didn't like in the book, and that's just one paragraph at the end of this where Ed talks a little bit about video game violence, and he talks about how video games make people more violent, and he talks about how it's been proven. I don't know where he got this from, because it hasn't been proven that there's a connection between video games and violence. It just seemed kind of weird and out of place for me while I was reading this, where I'm like, okay, why are you throwing that last part in here? That's really not true, or at least hasn't been proven yet, or anything like that. It was a weird paragraph in an otherwise spectacular book. So aside from that one paragraph, this is an absolutely spectacular book. I definitely recommend it for everyone. It's just an absolutely amazing story. You know, Ed has lived just a really great life. He contributed a lot to home computers and also to the video game industry. I really think like this is something that everybody should read if they're even remotely interested in computers, or if they just want to get some life advice, because it's just really, really great. So anyway, guys, that's going to wrap it up. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Please let me know what you think in the comments below, and have a great day.